decide to step up to this kind of power, this kind of challenge, this kind of flying, crashing feeling, when you decide to get serious, there's only one place to come, the games of Super Nintendo. Now you're playing with power, superpower.
With over 80 million sold, the Nintendo Switch is one of the most loved and best-selling consoles. But did you know it all started with a series of unknown consoles that you didn't even know existed? It's not the NES or the Game Boy, it goes way back, even before Super Mario Bros. Welcome to Part 3, The Evolution of Nintendo. Nintendo's Game & Watch series became so popular that millions of bootleg versions were being sold around Asia. We must develop something that other companies cannot copy for at least 1 year, Hiroshi demanded. Immediately, Nintendo's designers and engineers worked together to come up with ideas. They settled on a new console with swappable game cartridges. While the concept wasn't new, Nintendo's version would have the quality of fast-speed animation and be priced lower than its competition. But for both to be possible, it would need custom chips that had to be outsourced to a semiconductor company. All the companies that Nintendo approached refused to work with them. One even considered their proposal absurd. Guarantee them 3 million chip orders within 2 years, Hiroshi instructed. Then they will give us a price. Eventually, one company did, even though it seemed impossible for Nintendo to use that many chips. While their first console was considered a success, they were only able to sell 30,000 units. Still, Hiroshi remained convinced that their new console would be more popular and profitable as long as they continued to release new and exciting games. Forgo profits on the hardware. It is just a tool to sell software. Games is where we shall make our money. 2 years later, Nintendo released its new console, the Family Computer, dubbed the Famicom. Just as Hiroshi predicted, it flew off the shelves and brought in more money than he had ever seen before. Even a recall to replace defective chips didn't stop the demand. Still, Minoru held back from selling the Famicom in the US. The video game market had crashed due to a flood of terrible games, and companies like Atari were going bankrupt. Minoru only reconsidered after suggesting the Famicom look more like a computer and have a security chip to lock out counterfeit games. Hiroshi followed his suggestions and added remote control and keyboard. He also named it the Advanced Video System. 1 year later, the AVS launched at the Winter Consumer Electronics Show. Attendees commented that it looked impressive, but had no interest in placing orders. They still believed that the video game business was dead and didn't think a computer-like system would bring it back. Minoru failed to realize that most people bought computers for business instead of entertainment, and when they didn't need to use it, they wanted to get as far away from it as possible. Fortunately, one good thing came out of attending the show. Minoru met Sam Borofsky. Sam ran a marketing firm that worked with several video game companies, including Atari. He had a hunch that the AVS would become the next big thing and convinced Minoru to rebrand it. Minoru took his advice, rebranded the AVS as an all-in-one entertainment center, and renamed it the Nintendo Entertainment System. 1 year later, the NES launched at the Summer Consumer Electronics Show. Attendees were still reluctant to place orders. Some even told Nintendo they missed the opportunity and didn't know what they were doing. People in the industry are jaded, Minoru insisted. Kids will love it. To prove his point, he ran focus groups where kids were able to play with the NES. This is shit, one commented. They and every other kid in the room hated it. Depressed, Minoru asked Hiroshi if he should give up. Hiroshi insisted he keep trying. Try to sell the system in one American city, he advised. We must get it into the hands of the customer. This is the only test that matters. Minoru took Hiroshi's advice and even followed a bold suggestion. selling the NES in the most challenging city to start in, New York. After settling in the city, Minoru met with department stores and electronic retailers. Every single one of them gave the same answer: they weren't interested. So Minoru changed his strategy and offered a risk-free proposal, allowing them to return any unsold products. Hiroshi was shocked. He didn't understand why it was necessary. The ultimate sign of strength is to have so much confidence in your product that you would almost pay stores to carry it, Minoru insisted. And he was right. Stores did agree to carry the NES, but that didn't mean they had more faith in the product. It's your funeral, one buyer warned. While Nintendo sold half of its NES shipment, retailers determined it wasn't a viable product. Still, Minoru moved forward with testing the NES around the US. He managed to sell more units, but growth was considered slow. So he reached out to his former neighbor in Vancouver for help, Peter Main. Peter was a restaurant executive who knew nothing about the video game industry, but Minoru was willing to bet his outside experience would be valuable and convinced him to join Nintendo. After researching the market and industry crash, Peter met with Wall Street analysts to pitch Nintendo. They were always looking for the next big thing and potential clients with strong balance sheets. Not a single analyst knew anything about Nintendo until Peter sat with them. Still, every one of them were impressed. Nintendo had a lock on 90% of the industry in Japan, and its balance sheet had no debt. Soon after, the Wall Street analysts started telling retailers about Nintendo. When other analysts heard about the news, it started a chain reaction. More retailers started carrying Nintendo's products, and some increased their orders. Having the top analysts talk about Nintendo gave them a credibility it never had before and recognition that it was the next big thing in America. Afterwards, the NES became the top-selling toy in the country. More than 7 million units were sold along with 33 million games. Best-selling games include Duck Hunt, Super Mario Bros., The Legend of Zelda, and Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! The numbers validated Hiroshi's strategy to focus on games and Minoru's plans to prevent another market crash. From then on, the NES became a staple in American households. Many of them bought an unprecedented number of games from Nintendo and its licensees. And since licensees were only allowed to make up to 5 games a year, they were encouraged to only develop high-quality ones. But yet again, success brought on new problems. A chip shortage hit the US and the rest of the world. It became so severe that only a handful of companies survived unscathed. Nintendo wasn't an exception. When the NES took off, Nintendo struggled to meet the demand for its products. Its hardware units and games required various chips that were scarce from the global shortage, which became so severe it was compared to the oil crisis. Even worse for Nintendo, all sides of the industry turned on them. When Nintendo couldn't fill orders, licensees accused it of fabricating the shortage, and companies threatened to sue and even physically attack Peter. To them, Nintendo was single-handedly destroying their business. In truth, Nintendo was no exception to surviving the chip shortage unscathed. It was forced to scrap its own games from its catalog, including Donkey Kong, and lost millions of dollars. Fortunately, morale remained high among Gunpei and his team of designers, programmers, and engineers. They came up with a new invention that married the NES and Game & Watch series, a console that could be played anywhere, in cars, trains, and even planes. It was called the Game Boy. When Minoru saw a Game Boy prototype, he had a hunch that it needed a particular game to drive sales. And he knew just the perfect one: Tetris. The game was simple and hypnotic, and the blocks were large enough to see on a small screen, but obtaining the console rights would be much like the premise of the game, a complicated puzzle. At the time, the Soviet Union owned Tetris, and Andromeda Software was the only company that was given the rights. Andromeda contracted Mirrorsoft to produce the game in the UK, and Mirrorsoft contracted Atari to create a console version. When Nintendo's lawyers tried to negotiate for the console rights, they had a hunch that Andromeda, Mirrorsoft, and Atari didn't actually have them. Suspicious, Hiroshi and Minoru sent an emissary to Moscow so that Nintendo could be the first, Hank Rogers. Hank was a young game designer who made a version of Go for Nintendo. Over time, he became one of the few people who became close with Hiroshi. He didn't have any connections in Moscow and couldn't speak Russian, but knew how to find his way in the middle of any storm. After arriving in Moscow, Hank discovered that Nintendo's suspicions were right. The Soviet Union had yet to give any company the console rights to Tetris. Andromeda was only given the PC rights. Later, Hank managed to track down the creator of Tetris, Alexei Pachinov. Alexei was a software engineer who developed Tetris while working for Moscow's computer center. When Alexei met Hank, he could tell that he was truly passionate about the game and understood the beauty of its design. So he told the Soviet officials that Nintendo was the best company to work with. Soon after, Nintendo was given the console rights to Tetris. 2 months later, the Game Boy and Tetris bundle was released. It sold out within 2 weeks, and like Hiroshi and Minoru predicted, games, particularly Tetris, drove sales. Within 3 years, Nintendo's net sales jumped from $2.3 billion to $5.2 billion. Games accounted for more than half of its profits, and because of its success, the video game industry started thriving again. Soon after, Nintendo was seen as a threat by companies outside its industry. Toyota lost to Nintendo as Japan's most successful company, and Apple revealed Nintendo was the company it feared the most. In the following decades, Nintendo was recognized as launching some of the world's greatest consoles, including the Game Boy, Nintendo 64, GameCube, Nintendo DS, Wii, and Nintendo Switch. It was also recognized as launching some of the world's best-selling game franchises, including Donkey Kong, Mario, Pokemon, Super Smash Bros., Legend of Zelda, and Animal Crossing. And amid the coronavirus pandemic, Nintendo became the richest company in Japan. Profits soared by more than 400%. In a Washington Post article, writer John Irwin highlights one of Nintendo's biggest keys to survival. The company's work has always pushed back against who can or how they should play games. They've been willing to experiment and fail because they're fiscally responsible. More than anything, Nintendo's sustained success in time of crisis is due to the simple belief that joy matters. For more inspiring stories about today's most successful brands, don't forget to subscribe to our channel.